to introduce Dr. Mugisha. It is a privilege for me to introduce him as someone who's been a leading figure in Uganda's LGBTIQ plus movement as Executive Director of Sexual Minorities Uganda, as a coalition, and leading the Associated International, NGO SMUG International, and also as part of the more recent coalition called Convening for Equality. He's now known and respected globally in the worldwide LGBTIQ plus movement. In 2004, while still at university, Dr. Mugisha founded the organization Icebreakers as a support organization for LGBT people. He became a co-founder of Sexual Minorities Uganda, and as certain religious groups funded from the United States fed homophobia in the country, he led opposition to the first anti-homosexuality bill, which was initially proposed with the death penalty for certain homosexual acts from 2009, which moved even beyond existing British colonial laws, which were already criminalising life imprisonment. The first Anti-Homosexuality Act was passed briefly in 2014, but was struck down by the Supreme Court. For his work supporting human rights, Dr. Mugisha has been extensively honoured internationally. For support of human rights, he was awarded the Thorolf Rafto Memorial Prize in 2011. And in 2011, he was also the recipient of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award, through which he gained valuable contacts with Kerry Kennedy and others in US politics, with support expressed from figures such as Hillary Clinton. In 2014, we welcomed Dr. Mugisha to the University of Glasgow for the first time when he was a keynote speaker at the LGBTI Human Rights in the Commonwealth Conference that we co-organised with Equality Network and Kaleidoscope Trust. Dr. Mugisha made such an impression on participants, including the university's principal, that in 2015 he was honoured with one of the university's highest honorary degrees, the Doctor of the University degree, which he visited the university again to receive. And I recall with great pleasure how on graduation day in the Butte Hall, after his degree was announced, there was a great cheer and applause from not only the assembled students, but also their parents and families who were with them. And it really seemed that the whole university at that point wanted to express its support for his work for LGBTI human rights. Dr. Mugisha is thus an honoured guest here today and an old friend of the University of Glasgow. And it's my honour to introduce him as someone who I find a very insightful leader, as well as one of the bravest people that I've met. So Frank, we look forward to your talk. I think you may be muted.
I'm turning on the video now. Well, thank you so much, Matthew. I'm really pleased to be giving this talk this afternoon. Greetings to everyone from Kampala. And again, my apologies for being really late for this. I had a few emergencies that came up. As many of you will know that we have been trying to do our best to make sure that the anti-gay bill is not signed into law by the president. We also try to do our best to make sure that the parliament doesn't pass it. But unfortunately, the parliament passed it. And now the trajectory doesn't seem to be very clear if the president will sign or not sign. But it looks like it is moving to that direction where he might end up signing. So first, I'd like to thank you, Matthew, and for organizing this with the entire team that you've worked with. I'd like to thank Glasgow University for the support, back then and now, and the continuous support that I've received after getting the honorary degree. I greatly appreciate that. And on that note, I'll immediately start my talk today. I'll try to look at a few aspects. One, the background, and then I'll see where we are right now. And then I will, of course, give some recommendations on how you can support us. And then I'll be very happy to take questions. So I'll be very quick with my presentation so that it is more interactive and we're able to have an engagement and you can know how to support. First of all, I would like to say that what we're seeing right now is different from what we saw back then when the anti-gay bill was introduced in Uganda in 2009 in our parliament. Back then, rather, there was more debate that was more national. We could single out the anti-gay groups and know that these specific members of parliament, these specific politicians, or these specific church leaders are the anti-gay groups. And of course, there were ex-gay groups back then as well. We could single them out. And the bill received a lot of international attention because of the death penalty. This time around, there has been the anti-gay groups and the anti-gender groups have done their background very well by, first of all, doing a lot of campaigns in Uganda here. Prior to introduction of the anti-gay bill, I was personally singled out. I received a lot of threats, a lot of verbal and physical threats, social media, on my phone. My organization and some of my colleagues were arrested because of some of this propaganda. My organization was shut down by the National NGO Bureau. This is the official government body that regulates NGOs. And after the shutting down of the organization, SMAG, there was indication that they wanted to shut down more organizations that support the LGBT community here in Uganda. So the anti-gay bill is not an isolated incident that has happened in Uganda to the LGBT community. The conservativeness, or rather the conservative views from members of parliament and our politicians are deep-rooted and have been ongoing for a long time. There are so many different associations and organizing in parliament. There is the National Prayer Breakfast that is well known by many people, that is hugely and heavily supported by American evangelicals. There is the Family Values Caucus that is in parliament as well. So these groups, they work with other groups, including church groups and the rest, so increasingly support conservative, extremely conservative views in the country. And of course, they have mounted up campaigns, and these campaigns are ongoing. Most of these campaigns are more visible locally. And these campaigns run in social media like WhatsApp and TikTok. The notion that is being peddled is that homosexuality is un-African, it is Western. LGBTQ persons are promoting an agenda that is not African. So if you speak about the the human rights of LGBTQ persons, you are seen as someone who is promoting something that is Western and non-Ugandan or not African. And the worst is that LGBTQ persons are grooming youngsters and recruiting young people into homosexuality. And in Uganda, if you speak about young people, first of all, you're seen as a very big threat to society because Uganda is a very young population. And so every person cares about children. I care about children greatly. If I know that harm is coming to my nephews and nieces, I'll be concerned. So the anti-gay groups are using this notion that there's recruitment of children into homosexuality grooming of youngsters into homosexuality. And all this narrative and propaganda is based on conspiracy theories. There's no empirical data at all. In fact, there's a lot of empirical data to show that the abuse of young people is majorly by heterosexual adult individuals in Uganda. So, and I've argued many times that, homosexuality is not Western, because there's a lot of anthropological evidence that shows that same-sex relations existed throughout the entire Africa before colonialism or before any Western powers were seen in Uganda. And there was no particular stigmatization of any person who was either visibly known as LGBTQ or was perceived as LGBTQ. Even myself growing up here in Uganda, I mean, Uganda is a very friendly country. For many people who have visited Uganda, you will know that Uganda is a welcoming country. That is why it was named the Pearl of Africa, for being very green, but also having friendly people. I grew up in an environment where stigmatizing LGBTQ persons was not known. Yes, there was frowning upon LGBTQ persons. There were a few politicians and religious leaders who spoke out once in a while and disagreed with homosexuality. But no one was calling for LGBTQ persons to be killed. No one was saying LGBTQ persons are recruiting people into homosexuality. No one was saying that any person who is known as perceived as LGBTQ should not be allowed to rent a house or should be reported to authority. This narrative kept growing as many of the American evangelicals, especially to do work around HIV and AIDS. So fast forward, because we're talking about the anti-gay bill today. So the anti-gay bill was introduced in our parliament in 2003, this year. This is the first legislation to be fast-tracked. It was expedited. It was only in our parliament for 9 days. It did not go through the major scrutiny that many bills go through. It was debated. In fact, there was no clear debate. There was no debate. It was the second and third reading to passing of the legislation happened in one afternoon. And during the time when the legislation was being debated or towards passing it, members of parliament views were extremely homophobic, extremely conservative. Some members of parliament calling for LGBTQ persons to be castrated as a punishment. This legislation was introduced to parliament without the death penalty. The provision of the death penalty was only introduced on the floor of parliament. And the views that were expressed by members of parliament, some of these views reflect the public, how the public has been debating and speaking about this legislation. Yes, there are some members of parliament, of course, who are progressive, including a member of parliament who authored the minority report, but that is a handful. And even for those that are supportive of the community, they are afraid for their own political careers to speak out in public in support of the LGBTQ community. So again, if you look at what is happening now and what happened back then in 2009, in 2009, we did not see as many anti-gay campaigns as we're seeing now. In 2009, we did not see a lot of investment from anti-gay groups and religious groups as we're seeing now. In 2009, we did not see as much harm done to the community as we're seeing now. Right now, we have both law enforcement, ordinary Ugandans harassing and discriminating LGBTQ persons. In fact, the harassment of LGBTQ persons is majorly at the moment from ordinary Ugandans, because they have been radicalized by the anti-gay groups into hatred. So we're seeing a lot of cases of violence and attack on the LGBT community coming from neighbors, family members. Many LGBTQ persons have lost friends, or some of their colleagues and friends do not want to associate with them because of the fear that they are visibly known as LGBTQ persons. So right now, some of the key provisions that I wanted to highlight, one is aggravated homosexuality in this legislation. So aggravated homosexuality would punish any person who engages in sexual acts with any person under the age of 18, or any person who engages in sexual acts if they are living with HIV and AIDS, or any person who is in authority over the other person, or any person who abuses another person. So yes, we may agree with sexual abuse, we may agree with child abuse, but again, the death penalty under aggravated homosexuality, the death penalty is also for serial offenders, meaning someone who breaks the law more than once could be executed. So renting out of premises. So a 7-year sentence for any person who rents out premises for the purposes of LGBTQ activities. This law that is supposed to protect children would punish queer young persons with 3 years in prison. And I've said this many times before, and growing up, if anyone was known or rumored to be LGBTQ, they would either get suspended from school, worse, they would get expelled. Now what we're seeing is they're getting lynched in schools, they're getting beaten, but now the law is coming in and saying that these young people should be sent to prison for 3 years. Of course, this bill further criminalizes same-sex marriage and consensual sex acts. On the recommendation of the president, the bill does not criminalize someone for simply identifying as LGBTQ. But the first introduction of the bill, the first version of the bill did criminalize that. And again, with or without this bill being passed or signed into law, the effect is already being felt. One, like I mentioned, there's already harassment of LGBTQ persons is already happening. We've seen blackmail and extortion, LGBTQ persons. Social discrimination, we're seeing that happen. We've been seeing demonstrations that have happened, including from all corners of religion, religious, the Anglican, Muslim, demonstrating and asking for this bill to be signed. So what are we doing as the community? One, if this legislation is signed by the president, we are definitely going to go to court and challenge it. Number two, we are trying to monitor social media. And of course, what we're seeing coming out of social media is a lot of verbal threats, a lot of abuse on social media, and a lot of bullying to the LGBT community in Uganda. We're organizing through the Convening for Equality. This is a coalition that is bringing together civil society and LGBTQ groups to fight back against this legislation. One, by controlling the narrative and providing accurate information from the ground. Number two, asking our partners, both national, regional, and international, on how they can help and support us. Number three, working with our legal partners to make sure that this bill is challenged if it is signed by the president. I mentioned how the anti-gay and anti-gender movement is evolving in this country. and how we're seeing our parliament getting very conservative. Just recently, Uganda hosted the first African Regional Interparliamentary Conference and dialogue on the global challenges to the protection of the African child, African family, and the African cultural values, which was held on the 30th of April here in Uganda. The communique and the communique that came out of this conference and the language is drumming up for other African countries to come up with similar legislations that punish LGBTQ persons. In fact, one of the members of parliament who was here in Uganda attending this conference already plans to introduce a similar legislation in Kenya. So the fear is that this anti-gay and anti-gender movement is going to be create a ripple effect in the entire Africa. And we're not only looking at the anti-gay bill. In Uganda, there is also the sexual offences bill. One of the members of parliament just took leave to draft and reintroduce the sexual offences bill. The sexual offences bill was in our parliament before, and it was passed by parliament. The president of Uganda rejected it, and it was returned to parliament. It had provisions that would punish unnatural sexual offences. So there's some feeling of our members of parliament being obsessed with punishing homosexuality. And by the way, homosexuality is already punished in Uganda under our penal code. Is punishable under our penal code. And this penal code was unfortunately introduced by the British. The same way the extreme American evangelicals are supporting anti-gay legislations at this moment in Uganda, Ghana, and other countries. The same way the British introduced the sodomy laws. So all these laws are not our laws. These laws are not Ugandan laws. These laws are supported by Westerners. But ironically, the LGBTQ community is being accused of having the Western agenda, whereas homophobia is the actual Western agenda. Family Watch International was here in Uganda supporting this conference that happened. And of course, we see visibly anti-gay Christians meeting up with our politicians, our religious leaders, and they're not afraid to do that. Because again, Uganda is a very faithful country. Anything a religious leader says will be believed and accepted. So they are happy to team up with religious leaders and support these very draconian and extreme legislations. I'll stop there for now so that I'm able to take more questions and engage broadly with everyone. Thank you so much and appreciate all the support.
Thank you so much, Frank. That was extremely helpful as an overview of the situation, both the legislation and also the community responses and so on. And the absolutely key point is that the president's signature is still needed for this to become law. So the question of what lobbying and political leverage could be exerted about that. Just to follow up on what you were saying about the provisions of the bill, which I had a read of the bill, and from what I could understand also from coverage, the aggravated homosexuality offence does include the death penalty for people who are convicted more than once of sexual acts. So, which is something I think has not actually been clearly reported in all of the UK media coverage. So it's not only in relation to people with HIV or children and so on, it's also includes simply repeated sexual acts that are, you know, if you're convicted more than once. But I also just wanted to mention that clause 11 makes promotion of homosexuality an offence punishable for up to 20 years. And that seems particularly concerning for its impact on you and on organising, that effectively that could be used to prohibit all LGBTIQ organising in the country. So, you know, if the legislation goes through, then that would have a really profound silencing effect and sort of transform the landscape for organising. Do you want to comment on that? How you're seeing that?
Thank you. As I was rushing through my presentation, I missed that. But this is a very key point to note, that the legislation would punish promotion of homosexuality, which is one, broad, and number two, vague. The definition of what promotion entails is not very clear. So, because it refers to text, any kind of text or information. So by simply someone saying that Frank is gay and it's okay, they could be criminalized for that. So the vagueness, so my work, speaking out, my social media accounts would be seen as promotion. Having engaging in a webinar like this, or any other Ugandan way engages in a webinar like this, could be seen as promotion of homosexuality. So this would broadly punish. And like I've mentioned many times, this legislation's aim is to erase the entire existence of an LGBTQ person, because it silences any kind of voice of reason. Organizations, a colleague was talking about the importance of the continuity of Uganda's work on HIV and AIDS and making sure that no one is left behind. So some of the partners who work in supporting the key populations that include the LGBT community could be criminalized under promotion of homosexuality.
Thank you. Can I also ask you about the political context in Uganda, particularly looking at how large the majority was in Parliament? So, you know, the main majority party is the National Resistance Movement, and then you have opposition parties, the Forum for Democratic Change and National Unity Platform, led by Robert Kyagulanyi Ssentamu, known as Bobby Wine. Can you give us any kind of comment on, do you see any kind of openings in those other parties? Or are there any kind of openings within the National Resistance Movement party? And perhaps maybe comment on how this relates to sort of broader politics in Uganda. You know, clearly this bill is being used in terms of political homophobia as a kind of strategy by various political actors. You know, what are the kind of openings for sort of changing the political discourse?
So this bill is definitely used by some politicians to gain popularity or to get power, and also for them to cover up for some of the things that haven't fulfilled in their own constituencies. So they feel like by being extremely homophobic, then they will get support from many Ugandans. But I think members of Ugandan parliament should know that Ugandans are not stupid. They're Ugandans who can reason and who can see reason and see that the issue of homosexuality is only being used. Because one, they are talking about recruitment of children. They're not providing any data. They're not providing any information on people who have been recruited or abuse of children. So I think this narrative will die out soon. But going back to the key issue that you asked around political support, I can assure you there are members of parliament who do not support this legislation at all. But the issue is they can't speak out. They are so afraid that if they speak out, they will be held accountable by their own colleagues who are very, very homophobic. And they know that if they speak out, they will lose their votes. They will lose support from their constituencies. Our parliament has over 500 members of parliament. And out of that, I think when the vote happened the last time, it was about 61% that were in parliament and that voted for this legislation. So that is about 341 members of parliament out of the over 500 did vote. So definitely there are about members of parliament, about almost 200 members of parliament who did not vote for this legislation. Either they were aware or they did not agree with this legislation. In terms of the political, across the different political parties, I'm afraid to say when it comes to the issue of homosexuality, we can't measure that because it is more of an individuals. It's not a party decision. There hasn't been any party that has come out clearly to say either we don't support the bill or we support the bill. There haven't been that clarity. It's individuals within different political parties that either support or don't support. And also when it comes to, being conservative and being majority of politicians are actually conservative and anti-gay from all parties. We've tried to ask opposition leaders their opinions on this legislation and have been evasive. We've tried to ask the ruling party their position on homosexuality. They have been evasive as well. So there's no clarity to how if they support or don't support. It's only individuals and from all different parties.
Thanks, that's very helpful. And just one more very quick question. Can you just explain about the new group Convening for Equality? How does that relate to Sexual Minorities Uganda?
So the Convening for Equality came about to try and push back on some of the most extreme legislations, but also to support communities that are discriminated. So the Convening for Equality right now comprises of LGBT community members, partners from civil society, and some of the legal partners that are supporting us. So it is similar to what happened in 2009 when the Kill the Gays bill was introduced. We had the Civil Society Coalition on Human Rights and Constitutional Law. So this is similar, it's a similar mechanism. Now, and the role of the Convening for Equality is try and bring in everyone, but also to have a lot, to get a lot of support from Uganda and Ugandans. So that again, this is not seen as a Western agenda. So that this is seen that Ugandans are pushing back against this legislation. They are speaking out, they are concerned about this legislation. So there are many Ugandans who are in the Convening for Equality who disagree with the legislation. But our role is also to provide with our partners, both within the country, outside the country, with the best response on how they can support the LGBTQ community. And we're not limiting the work for the Convening for Equality to only around the anti-gay legislation, but also similar legislation like the sexual offenses bill that will affect the LGBT community, but also the sex work community. So, and Sexual Minorities Uganda, as you know, was shut down. So now SMAG exists as an ideology that brings together LGBTQ persons to create a voice and amplify a voice of LGBT community. And that is also very clear in the Convening for Equality that SMAG still provides that voice.
Thanks, that's very helpful. I'll just mention, as I did earlier, that links to these various organizations and statements coming from these organizations can be found on your Twitter account at Frank Mugisha, and people can also contact me if you want links to particular groups.